Neighbours, everybody needs good neighbours. Just a friendly wave each morning helps to make a better day. Neighbours need to get to know each other. Next door is only a footstep away. Neighbours, everybody needs good neighbours with a little understanding. You can find the perfect blend. Neighbours should be there for one another. That's when good neighbours become good friends.
Good on you, Barry. Give us a ring, 1300 800 222. Matt Soul is a Neighbours superfan in London and joins us on the program this morning. Hello, Matt.
Hello, good evening from London.
Hey, Matt, have you been with Neighbours since that theme?
Oh, absolutely. Almost since day one. So, 36, 37 years now, a long while.
I've always wondered what the attraction is to Neighbours for people in England, because you've got your own soapies. You've got Coronation Street and Emmerdale and EastEnders.
Well, I know that you guys get some of our soaps on Aussie TV, and our soaps, they do tend to be a little bit grey, a little bit miserable. It's like, especially EastEnders, somebody gets murdered every week and, it's gangsters. And I remember as a kid in the 80s, you turn Neighbours on and...
Oh, we've got a little bit of a fizz happening in the middle there. We'll see if we can work it out with Matt. If you want to join us, 1300 800 222. If you've been a Neighbours watcher, then tell us what it is about the program that you've enjoyed over time. Do you think the storylines have been important? Do they actually try to pick up on modern themes and things that are happening and incorporate them into the storylines? 1300 800 222. If you'd like to give us a ring, or text us on 04... Oh, we can't text, so just give us a ring. 1300 800 222. If you don't, what is it about those soapies that you don't particularly like? Because we can have a chat with Matt about that as well. If you've watched the English ones, why do people tend to prefer the Australian ones? 1300 800 222, the number to call. And I know there are many of you that have watched Neighbours and watch Neighbours now, but sometimes people don't like to fess up to it. So for some people, it's a guilty passion. For many people, it has been the staple of television for such a long period of time. If you want to join us, 1300 800 222, the number to call. Now, we've got you back, Matt. We were just talking about what it is about Australian soaps that people prefer.
Yes, I don't know how much you heard, but it's aspirational. It's that familiarity, but the sun always shines, the people are beautiful, everything's very middle class, versus what we get in British soaps where it's just a bit doom and gloom. So I think in the 80s, that's what grabbed people, was this life that we all wanted to lead in the sunshine in Erinsborough.
In Erinsborough. And it's become, for many people, a place that people will come to pay homage to Erinsborough. Have you managed to actually get to Vermont to have a look at the town itself, to have a look at the suburb?
Yeah, the first time I came to Melbourne, I think it was 2005, and we rented a car and we drove up to Pinoak Court. I didn't do the tour because I was a little bit embarrassed to get on a tour bus with Neighbours fans at the time. But yeah, it was kind of a little bit surreal walking up the street that I'd seen thousands of times for 20 odd years.
Are the storylines very different though with Australian soaps? In that they're very typical to us, but is it also something that's easy to relate to for English people as well?
I think it is. You've got kind of the big dramatic things that always get the headlines, and I think British soaps do that as well. What the British soaps don't do, that Neighbours and even Home and Away to a degree manages to do, is have that light comedic side to it. And I think the British people love that kind of, not quite sitcom, but that lighter kind of community thing that Neighbours does so well.
And a little bit tongue-in-cheek. It's a little bit of Australian humour in there as well.
Absolutely, absolutely. And I think the Brits and the Aussies have got very similar sense of humour.
I think a very good example of that is, now I can't remember the name. See, you'll be able to fill me in on these because I've never been one that's watched Neighbours a heck of a lot. But I think there was a marriage between two dogs in Neighbours.
Oh, that was Bouncer's dream. People always remember that episode. So Bouncer everybody remembers Bouncer from the 80s. I think he lived with everybody on the street at some point. And I can't remember how it was set up, but basically we went inside Bouncer's mind and he married another dog in his dream. That's probably one of the most ridiculous moments that Neighbours, like, you look back at it, it's like, how did that ever get past a production meeting? But it did.
And
it did.
But that's one of the great things about it, is that they were prepared to go those places and have a bit of fun with it and not be too serious.
Well, and they still do that now. There was a fantastic storyline a couple of years ago where Carl and Susan Kennedy, who have been in the show for near on 30 years, they came back from a trip to the Far East and they weren't talking to each other and nobody could understand why. And it turned out that Carl Kennedy was smuggling durian fruit back into Australia. And he got caught at customs because they smelt the durian. And he tried to blame it on Susan Kennedy pooing herself on the flight. And that's why there was a smell. It's ridiculous. And I think Neighbours is fantastic because they managed to do that. And then 2 scenes later, you've got a traumatic scene where somebody's diagnosed with ovarian cancer. That was a huge storyline at about the same time, actually, where one of the main characters went through a cancer diagnosis, and that light and shade, it's superb how it does that.
One of the things about the program is that, because I did extras work a long time ago and did some extras work on Neighbours, and I remember going to the outside areas that were shot at Nunawading, so the outside of Lassiter's. I think there's a bridge, a little bridge somewhere in the outside scenes.
That's gone.
Yeah,
they took it away, the bridge. Yeah, that was iconic. If you go back to the Kylie and Jason era of Neighbours, that bridge over the pool at Lassiter's was iconic. But yeah, they've refurbished that set quite a few times and the bridge is long gone, unfortunately. Because
I just remember how, like, when I actually got there, how boring the outside settings were. When you watch it on television, you don't get a concept of the inside and the outside and how well they actually shoot that. And just the outside settings. And I was an extra at a Bucks night for one of the storylines somewhere, which would have been about the late 80s, early 90s as well. And I think I was a waiter at a Bucks night.
Nice.
But that's all I remember of it. But there were so many people, and if you've been an extra in it, 1300 800 222, that if you worked anywhere near an extras set, then it was very likely you've done Neighbours at some time, Matt.
Yeah, well, Australia's been in Neighbours at some point. After 37 years, everyone must have had a go.
What is it, the storylines that have really tickled your fancy over a period of time?
Like I was saying before, the dark and the shade. If we go back to what I was saying before, the character Sonia Rebecca, Toadie's wife, who was diagnosed with ovarian cancer, and they've got young kids, and she actually died. They showed her death, which is unusual for Neighbours. Normally it's kind of like, oh, well, so-and-so's died. But there was a real tear-jerking scene, which was the culmination of this massive story where she died in Toadie's arm on the beach with the kids playing. That was probably one of the most emotional, and I don't think anybody watching had a dry eye. But then, you go to some of the funnier things like the Bouncer's Dream, and going back to the 80s, the arguments between Madge Bishop and Mrs. Mangle, and some of the situations they used to get themselves in. There's just so many. I think what Neighbours has done really well as well, more recently, they've diversified the cast and they've really addressed some some things that are happening in Australia. Only a few months after the same-sex marriage law was changed, Neighbours had the very first same-sex marriage on Australian TV, which was kind of massive, and great how they reacted so quickly to the law that changed in Australia.
If you want to join us, 1300 800 222 via text on 0437 774 774. Hello, George.
Hello, Trevor and Matt. It's interesting. I actually know a few people who've worked on the show. I'm based in Sydney, but they always used to tell me the funniest thing was, of course, Matt is alluding to how all the Brits over there are aspiring to come to sunny Australia. But as you know, Trevor, the middle of a Melbourne winter can be not necessarily the most sunny, summery place to be in the world. And they used to have to resort to certain kinds of tricks to kind of get around it. For example, in the middle of the Melbourne winter, people's breath tended to come out rather steamily, shall we say, indicating how cold the surrounding air temperature was. So to get around that, they'd actually get the cars to actually suck on ice cubes to try and lower their internal mouth temperature to the point where it wouldn't actually start steaming up every time they opened their mouth. Things like the swimming pool scenes, they tend to sort of shoot them obviously at a more summery time, and then they'd cut them in later if they're in the middle of a winter episode. They just cut in shots of the pool. Otherwise, they'd have people with goosebumps all over them, which would tend to not create the right image. But I'd also, in terms of the Sydney context, I remember in the 90s in particular, and going on to the 2000s, there are a lot of British backpacker magazines that were designed just for the British backpacker market in Sydney, and I used to sort of pick them up and read them with the music, and it was absolutely full of Neighbours and Home and Away, as well as what was going on in some of the British soap operas, so people could keep up. This is kind of before the internet became a really big thing, obviously. But yeah, they were absolutely obsessed, and I actually sort of stumbled on a couple of events at a couple of pubs and taverns where they'd actually have the Neighbours stars come along, and the backpackers would pay a certain amount, sometimes quite a large amount, to actually come along and meet their star attractions and get autographs and so forth. And it was just fascinating how starstruck they were. The other thing I'd mention, which is the big divide between Neighbours and Home and Away, there was a deliberate move, I know, in Home and Away to make it a bigger budget, kind of to make it look a bit more impressive. So they increased the budgets on Home and Away and did a lot more outdoor stuff and car chases, a lot more stuff in the landscape, which obviously suited the Home and Away setting a bit more than suburban setting in Erinsborough. And I think that's when Neighbours became the second tier, and then in Australia, for example, ended up on the alternative free-to-air networks, not the main networks for station for each network. And that's when it became obvious that in Australia, Neighbours had gone off the boil. And I know it was only being carried by the British, basically still having it as a major tier on their networks, and basically was subsidising the production here in Australia, because without the British involvement, Neighbours would have shut down many, many years ago.
Matt may disagree as far as the idea of the either being Home and Away or Neighbours people. Is that a thing, Matt?
I think it is now. Maybe back in the 80s when both shows were kind of at the pinnacle of the ratings, people would generally watch both. But yeah, now you tend to find that people are either one or the other, because they have very different styles. What I would say is Neighbours, production-wise, has upped its game incredibly over the last couple of years, and Fremantle TV have invested a lot of money upgrading the sets, upgrading the equipment. So when you watch Neighbours, it looks a lot richer than it probably did 10 years ago, where things did look a little bit cheap. But there is a very, very different feel.
With merchandise and that sort of stuff, is that big in England? Like, is there actually Neighbours merchandise as well?
Not so much now. It's like, I remember, again, going back to the late 80s when it was at its peak, you could literally buy anything with the Neighbours logo on: sweatshirts, mugs, Easter eggs, Like Neighbours was on everything. But yeah, merchandise, not so much of a thing nowadays. But it's the day of the internet. You can get anything you want online.
One of the things that was really popular as well, which wasn't in Australia but was significant in the UK, was people going to pantomime, because a lot of the actors did panto during the off-season. Was that something that you actually either went to or recognised as being big in England?
It was huge. The city that I grew up in, I grew up in a provincial city, and we never had any Neighbours actors in our panto. We did actually have Home and Away actors one year. Frank and Bobby from Home and Away in the 80s came and were in our panto. But yeah, and you know what? It still happens to this day. There's a lot of ex-Neighbours stars that made their way over to settle in the UK, and they still go out every year. And I know, in fact, Stephen Dennis, Paul Robinson, he lived in the UK for a number of years, and he met his wife working on a panto in the UK. So, yeah, the pantos are still a big deal.
Because I don't think people in Australia just understand how big pantomime is in England, because that's, in general, pantomime is just huge.
It is massive. Every towns or city will have multiple theatres running the pantos for, some of them are up to 10 weeks over the Christmas period. And they'll be doing sometimes 4 or 5 shows a day, and these are live theatre shows. So yeah, it's big, and I know that the stars get paid a lot of money.
So did people like Kylie and Jason and some of the big names all do it as well?
Jason did back in the day. I think kind of after the peak of his career, I think he went into to pantos for a little bit, but no, Kylie never. Kylie is a goddess and has never stepped foot on a panto stage as far as I'm aware.
Goddess. We'll come back to that in just a second. Jan joins us. Hello, Jan.
G'day, how you going?
Good, Jan.
I was in the UK in the late 80s, and it was in the holiday period, so some teacher mates had got me into a student hostel which was half empty. So it was cheap accommodation for me. Anyway, at 6 o'clock, some young people came hammering on my door so urgently I thought it was a fire, and they said, come quick, come quick. And so I followed them, and they took me to this theatre room, and it was full of young people and older people. I think the kitchen staff were there as well, and they were there to watch Neighbours. And I said, what are we doing here? And they said, it's Neighbours. And I said, oh, my goodness, I've never watched Neighbours in my life, and they couldn't believe me. It was like I had killed somebody on the spot. Now, the next thing that happened was, because I came from Australia, one of these poor students, about 19-year-old, 20-year-old girl, said, oh, my father's Australian. She'd never met her father. And she said, you might know him. I said, Australia's a big country. I won't know him. I said, well, and then she persisted, and I said, where does he live? And she actually mentioned my hometown. I thought, oh, you're kidding me. But anyway, the British were these young people were absolutely adamant that I had to watch this Neighbours. So I have watched an episode of Neighbours in the UK.
I wonder if it's bigger in England than it is over here, man.
Oh, it is. It's like, I know that Channel 10 in their infinite wisdom shoved it onto their digital channel, originally 11, now 10 each. And it's changed channels over here, but it's still, the ratings are still good. I know in Australia, like at the minute, I know it's the middle of your summer and people aren't watching TV, but Neighbours is getting like 150,000 viewers. Here in the UK, we actually just had a new set of ratings this week, and it's 1.5 million a day, which is nowhere near what it used to be in the 80s. But the way that we consume television obviously has changed a lot. It's one of the biggest shows on the daytime TV schedule in the UK by a long stretch. So yeah, it's still much bigger over here than it is in Oz.
Actually, do you know how you wanted to talk about jealousy? Chris, who's one of the producers here with the ABC on 774, he was a writer for Neighbours, I don't know how long ago. I just waved to him as he went past. So there are all sorts of people who are Neighbours related everywhere, Matt.
Oh, next time I come to Melbourne, you're going to have to hook me up.
When you take a look at some of the storylines, which have been incredible over a period of time, do you wonder that sometimes they've gotten rid of characters too early? And I guess Harold Bishop is a very good example of that, because we lost Harold and then he miraculously came back after just about swimming from Tasmania, wasn't it?
Yeah, so he disappeared, lost his memory, and was working in a Salvation Army shop, I believe, after he'd swum back from Tasmania. So, yeah, there's a few times that people have come back from the dead. We actually had another story a couple of years ago where Toadie's first wife, Dee, disappeared on their wedding night after he crashed the car into the ocean. And she did the same thing. She turned up 20 years later, not just by herself, though, with her identical twin sister that she didn't know she had. So that's another example of regretting killing a character off. They also did a web series. It was a time travel series, and they managed to be able to bring some of the characters they killed off, like Julie Martin, back from the dead through this time travel web series that they did.
Was it an evil twin?
Oh, she absolutely was the evil twin. So she came and, first of all, pretended to be Dee, managed to seduce Toadie, got pregnant, and then tried to take all of Toadie's money. And then her mum came along and tried to kill Toadie's wife. Yeah, evil twin.
What was it about? Number one, how did Toadie get rich?
Well, he's a lawyer now.
Oh, okay.
He is the worst lawyer in Australia. Any Neighbours fan will tell you. If you want to end up in jail, get Toadie Rebecca to represent you in court. Nobody ever gets off if Toadie's your lawyer. But yeah, I suppose he's made some good money because there's lots of crime in Erinsborough.
What was because the Rebecca family were a part of it in early as well. I remember that there were, and they all had interesting nicknames, the Rebecca family. How is it, do you think that some characters tend to stay like Toadie, but other ones within the Rebeccas go? And you can see that with different families as they've been through as well.
Yeah, I don't know what, like if you look at Toadie, Ryan Maloney, he's been there 25 years now, and I think we've just seen that character kind of grow, but I think as well for the actor, I think he's realised what a cushy gig he's got on Neighbours. You know, it's good, consistent work, which anybody who works in entertainment knows is very unusual. Whereas you've got other people that they get the bright lights, and unfortunately for every Kylie Minogue, every Jason Donovan, every Margot Robbie out there that has gone on to just become massive, there's lots of people that have left Neighbours thinking that they're going to conquer the world, and you never hear from them again. So I think Ryan Maloney has totally got it right.
There have been many people whose careers have been kick-started by Neighbours. We'll have a chat about that in just a second as well. If you would like to join us, 1300 800 222. If there are any storylines you wanted to mention, who are the characters that you've enjoyed? If you've never watched it and you want to tell us why, 1300 800 222 on text 0437 774 774. That's what we're talking about this morning. 1300 800 222. Our guest is Matt Soul, who's a Neighbours superfan in London, UK. He loves it if it's something that you've watched over the years. 1300 800 222 is the number to call. Matt, The Ramsays, the Robinsons and the Clarks were the original families that were followed in the beginning of the series. How many of them are still there?
None of them have been there all the way through. Paul Robinson was original cast, but he did leave for a number of years and came back. So he's the only one that was there in episode 1. But there's quite a few characters that are in the show still from the 80s and early 90s. So like Dr. Carl and Susan Kennedy, the king and queen of Erinsborough, they're still around. Plain Jane Superbrain, Annie Jones, who was one of Charlene's bridesmaids back in the 80s. She came back probably about 2 years ago. Melanie, if you remember from that era as well, who had the kind of goose laugh. She's back in the show as well and actually dating Toadie now. So there's a lot of familiar faces from that era, but only one original character.
But related to, are there people that are Clarks or Ramsays or Robinsons, not necessarily from the beginning, but are related to characters from the beginning?
Yep. So you got Roxy. Well, she's Roxy Canning now. She just got married. So her character is Gemma Ramsay's daughter, and Gemma was the niece of Madge Bishop. Obviously Jane, who was the granddaughter of Mrs. Mangle, she's there with her daughter. Paul has got about 4,000 children. He keeps discovering new ones every year. And the few of them live on the street as well. And not really linked into that, but Jason Donovan, of course, Scott Robinson from the 80s, his real life daughter, Gemma, plays Paul Robinson's granddaughter. So she's been on the show for 2 or 3 years now as well. So that's the third generation of Donovan that has lived on Ramsay Street.
G'day, Heath. How are you?
Hello, how you going?
Good, Heath.
Just tuned in on my early morning drive and was reminiscing about we used to, as a family, used to do the old 6:30 Neighbours that rolled into home and away at 7. And we're recalling we'd lived down in Sorrento, and I'm with my brother, and we couldn't quite remember. There was a scene filmed at the Continental Hotel where I think it was Dr. Carl or his wife was on the roof of the building, and it like stopped the whole. There's a big dramatic scene filmed down there. I wonder if you could recall that scene at all.
So it was on the roof of the Sorrento Hotel.
The Continental Hotel.
A Continental. What were they on the roof for?
I think it may have been an accident, or was it an attempted suicide? Maybe, I'm not too sure.
Do you recognise that, Matt?
No. What kind of year would that have been?
What year do you reckon, Heath?
Oh, maybe the 90s. Yeah, I remember. I remember as a local, it kind of stopped the town, and everyone was down watching the production of it all. And it's funny that the hotel's just about to reopen after a massive renovation. So yeah, it just got us thinking. But we thought we feel like it's something to do with Carl, but we can't remember.
Something to do with Carl. The hotel would have been on the beach. It would have been on the coast, Matt.
I can't remember, but I know that there's loads of the Neighbours online community listening in from all over the world right now. So I'm sure somebody will drop me a message or a tweet and correct me, but I can't think of what that could be.
When you go back and look at the people that have been through there, because it's been the start of many a career, whether it be short parts, whether they had small parts or large parts, Matt, who are some of the people that have come through that have had very successful careers outside of Kylie, of course?
Well, Russell Crowe. People forget that Russell Crowe was in the show back in the 80s. If I remember correctly, he tried to kill Kylie. I'm sure he set fire to the caravan that she was living in. Guy Pearce, of course, has gone on to have an absolutely stellar movie career. So many people have gone into music, people like Natalie Imbruglia, Valance. You know, every year you can look at Neighbours and look at people that have gone on to do really fantastic stuff. So I think if Neighbours does end production, that's going to be a huge loss for Australian talent. The training that those kids get going through that, producing 250 episodes a year of a TV show, you learn your craft really quick, and that that's going to be missing. And I think Australia's going to hurt losing that school.
Isn't it interesting, though, that there were just as many singers as actors actually came through there and had a career in music that then was also kickstarted in England as well?
Yeah, not all of them have been successful. It's like, if you look, I don't know if you remember the Alessi twins from the 80s. One of them got married to Paul Robinson, and they tried to release a couple of singles. Stephen Dennis, Paul Robinson himself, famously he was a bit of a one-hit wonder here in the UK. There was an album that was kind of a cast collective of them all singing Christmas carols. So there's been a lot of music come out of Ramsay Street, and not all of it good.
Not all of it good. I'm surprised you say that.
You know, that's one thing that I will say about Neighbours fans, is they are the most self-deprecating group of fans that you'll ever see. They will call...
Oh, the line might have just dropped out a little bit. We'll see if we can get Matt back. These are the marvels and the complications that would tend to happen sometimes when we actually talk to people overseas, especially when we're doing connections via the line. We'll see if we can get Matt back. We've got a text here that's asked whether, well, it's not a text, someone called earlier to find out if Neighbours actually got axed early and then got reinstated. So we might see if we can get an answer from Matt on that as well. Overnight, we're about 5 minutes away from the next ABC News. Our guest is Matt Soul, Neighbours superfan in London. Matt, there's a text here that says, did it get axed early on and then reinstated?
In Australia, it did. A lot of people will probably forget that when Neighbours started in 85, it was actually on Network 7 rather than 10. And it only lasted a few months. They canned it, and Grundy, as it was then, managed to sell it on to 10. They bought new casting, including Kylie and Jason, and relaunched it. It's never been canned in the UK, but it has swapped networks. So 2008, I think it was, the BBC lost the rights and it was moved over to Channel 5, and that's where it's been ever since.
People also talk about programs jumping the shark when they sort of went off. Do you think there's been a time that Neighbours jumped the shark?
Oh, well, we already talked about Bouncer's Dream.
I've never watched Neighbours very much, Matt, but I actually love the idea of Bouncer's Dream, so I would say that was a point of jumping the shark.
But when they retcon stories, and it's like they'll go back and rewrite history for the convenience of storytelling, and things like bringing people back from the dead, and how many affairs the same person can have and still be married to the same person. Like, I think jumping the shark is an almost weekly occurrence in Erinsborough. I don't know if you caught it before I got disconnected before, but say the fans will call Neighbours out when it's being ridiculous, but that's why we love it. Because it is ridiculous sometimes.
The thing about jumping the shark is that, and for people who aren't aware, that's when a TV series goes bad and they'll either try and do something dramatic to make it better, or it just sort of like goes off. And it comes from when Fonzie jumped the shark in Happy Days and the series was never the same afterwards. It's not really the same though, is it, Matt? Because it's not as if there was something that happened that then made the series go bad after that. It has its moments, perhaps.
No, I don't think they've ever done anything out of desperation. Any time that they've come up with a ridiculous storyline, it normally pays off, and it's normally to the amusement and the joy of the fans. So, yeah, they definitely have never ruined the show by trying to jump a shark.
There's been cases where they've brought characters back because maybe it's to reinvigorate or to bring back people who have been followers of Neighbours. And part of that is probably one of the most evil characters that's ever been seen on Neighbours.
Are you talking about Millsy?
They brought Millsy back.
Yeah, so Millsy was put away in prison, and eventually he was kind of like quasi-murdered by Susan Kennedy because he turned into a psycho killer. He set fire to an island trying to murder everybody. He actually killed a couple of people and tried to murder Susan. So, yeah, that was like the evil character that they brought back.
Evil characters are important. Who's been the most evil character that has ever been seen in Neighbours?
Ooh. Well, Millsy was pretty much up there. He also tried to gas everybody in the school. That was one of his high points. But as well, there was a fantastic character a couple of years ago, played by Christy Whelan-Brown, who I know is well known in Australia. And she was kind of a psycho stalker, and stabbed somebody in a maze. So, yeah, Scarlett, Christy Whelan-Brown, she did a fantastic job bringing the crazy to that character.
Matt, we're coming up to our news. Do you think that you'll be successful in trying to make sure that we don't lose Neighbours?
I, in my heart of hearts, really do think so. I think every chance is out there. The show is worth so much to Australia. It's worth so much to the UK. Hashtag Save Neighbours on Twitter. Come and follow us. I'm at Naytweets on Twitter. We've got a petition that I think has now just edged 25,000 signatures online. So if we go down, we are not going down without a fight.
And even if you don't like Neighbours, maybe just support the people that love it in England.
Well, exactly. And support Australia. The export of your culture, the jobs that show creates, it's so important to Melbourne's economy. So, yeah, support Australia.
Thank you very much for that, Matt. It's news time.